In your notebook, turn to a new page or grab a new sheet of paper, and at the top, just write Chapter 8. Chapter 8. In this chapter, we're going to hear about the trouble over taxes with Great Britain. So what I'd like you to do is anything you see underlined on a page, that's what I would like you to write. So let's start with this guy over here. His name was George Grenville. George Grenville was the Prime Minister of Great Britain. So he was working right underneath the king. The king was in charge of Great Britain then, and his first helper, or the man who was in charge of running the government, was called the Prime Minister. So this is George Grenville. Well, he realized that Britain was in desperate need of money because they owed a lot of money from the French and Indian War that they were just involved in America. So George Grenville came up with a plan. It said, how is he going to raise all of that money that they needed? Well, of course he came up with an idea. He was going to tax all of those colonists from Great Britain that moved to America to live. After all, he said, those British soldiers were protecting them, and the colonists were from Britain after all. So that was his idea. Because Great Britain was running out of money, he was going to tax all of those Americans that had moved away from England and make them pay taxes even though they weren't even living in Great Britain anymore. So how do you think those Americans are going to feel about that? Let's see. Well, he took his idea to King George III. Now, King George was the man in charge of Great Britain then, and King George thought it was a great idea. He supported the idea to tax the colonists, and so did the Parliament. That was Britain's law-making assembly. It's kind of like our Senate and our House of Representatives. They all said, great idea, George Grenville. Let's tax those colonists and let's make them pay all of that money. So Great Britain, their parliament, passed an act called the Stamp Act in 1767. So you have a little bit to write on this page. The Stamp Act did this. It put a tax on all printed materials in America. That means if you wanted to use any paper that had print on it, such as a legal document, or if you wanted to buy a newspaper or make a newspaper, or if you wanted to play cards or write a letter that had something printed on it, you would have to pay a tax on anything that was printed. That was called the Stamp Act. Well, the colonists were really upset about this. They thought, for one thing, why are we paying all of these taxes all of a sudden? We don't even live in Great Britain anymore. So what the colonists did was they protested. Let's look at some pictures down here. So protesting means you are showing them that you are not happy with what they are making you do. So they gathered in groups, like here in New Hampshire. They gathered in large groups and they put up like a stuffed dummy of somebody from Great Britain, and they threw things at him. They made like a skull and crossbones here and said, this is what we think of that Stamp Act. And the colonists were really upset about having to pay money to Great Britain. So along came a man named Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry was a lawyer from Virginia, and he was the first to really speak out against Britain. So write what's underlined on this page. So Patrick Henry, when he saw all these taxes that were going on, he stood out and he began to make speeches. He was famous for his brave speeches that inspired others to act. People listened to him and they agreed with him. And soon all of the colonists began to unite under the British, against the British taxes. So here's some pictures of Patrick Henry here. He was a smart man, and he was really good at speaking. He would go in front of people and say, "Come on, America, what is going on? We shouldn't have to pay for printed materials. This is our country. It's not fair. Now, we can't sit by and let them do this to us." And the more he spoke, the more people began to agree with him. So Patrick Henry was the first to really speak out against Great Britain. Another man we're going to hear about later on was named Samuel Adams. Now, Samuel Adams is also soon going to become a very important leader in our colonies. He agreed with what Patrick Henry was saying. Samuel Adams wasn't maybe as good a speaker as Patrick Henry was, but Samuel Adams was really good at getting things done. He was a doer. Patrick Henry, he was a speaker. So here's what Samuel Adams did. He organized a group and he called it the Sons of Liberty. And the Sons of Liberty were the ones that began to lead protests against the new Stamp Act. Now, if you were in the Sons of Liberty, you didn't want it to be known that you were in this group. It was kind of a group that was secret, that they didn't let people know who was in this group because they didn't want to get in trouble with the soldiers from Great Britain. So they secretly met and they organized protests. And they began to scare these Stamp Act agents. So Great Britain had these people that would come around into town and gather up the money on all of the printed materials. And the Sons of Liberty thought, let's scare those guys that are coming into town to get that money. So before they would come into town, they would do things like in the picture over here, they would dress up a dummy that looked like the Stamp Act man, and they would hang him from a tree branch so that when the Stamp Act agent would come into town, it would scare them. He would know that, boy, these people don't like me in this town. And they began to organize protests all throughout the colonies in different cities. Well, you know what? It worked. And soon the Stamp Act was repealed in 1766. Repealed means they ended it or they rejected it. So Great Britain went, well, this Stamp Act isn't working. And they realized that they would have to come up with something else besides the Stamp Act. And that is where we're going to end for